"She won't last a week here," the Duke said, and set down his glass with the flat certainty of a man laying a wager he could not lose. "A month, if her pride is stubborn. But she will run, Aldous. They always run." The butler said nothing, which was his particular gift, and Ledwin, Duke of Denstone, took the silence for agreement. He stood at the tall window of his study while the November rain crawled down the glass in long grey threads, and below him, in the sweep of the carriage court, a girl in a travelling cloak too thin for the season was being handed her single trunk by a footman who had already turned his back on her before her feet touched the gravel. "You disapprove," Ledwin said. He did not turn around. "I would not presume, Your Grace." "You presume constantly. It is the only reason I keep you." He watched the girl below tilt her face up toward the great stone front of Denstone Hall, and he waited as he always waited for the flinch. Everyone flinched at the hall. It was built to make men feel small, and it did its work honestly. But the girl only looked at it the way one looks at weather, a thing to be endured, not feared. And then she bent and lifted her own trunk before the footman could be shamed into doing it, and carried it toward the servant's door under her own arm. Something in Ledwin's chest shifted minutely, and he disliked the sensation and named it irritation. "Her name," he said. "Miss Roswin Underhill, Your Grace. The late Mr. Underhill's daughter. Your father stood godfather to him, some 40 years past, before the family's fortunes declined." Declined. Ledwin let the word sit. "Aldous, the girl arrives in a cloak I would not use to cover a hound, carrying her own baggage into my house, and you say the family declined. The family fell off a cliff. And now, by the terms of some yellowed promise my father made over a card table, that wreckage washes up on my doorstep to be fed and clothed and made a lady of, and I am to pretend I chose it." He turned at last from the window. "I did not choose it. I inherited it, as I have inherited every other unpaid debt in this house." The study was warm and dim, lined floor to ceiling with books the last 3 dukes had bought and none had read, and the fire threw a restless gold across the hard plains of Ledwin's face. He was not yet 40, but the reserve on him was older than that, a stillness men mistook for cruelty and women mistook for challenge, and both were wrong. It was neither. It was the face of a man who had learned, precisely once and at great cost, what it did to a person to be believed and then abandoned, and who had resolved never to be caught out so again. He had been 26 when Sabrina bore engagement 3 weeks before the wedding and left England on the arm of a man with a warmer temper and a larger fortune, and she had done it in a letter, 4 lines, unsigned by anything but her Christian name. And the whole of the county had known before he did. He had learned that day that affection was a door people used to walk out through. He had kept his own door shut ever since. "She is to have the blue rooms," Aldous said, "as Your Grace instructed. The blue rooms are too good for her. They are the coldest in the house, Your Grace. The chimney has not drawn since Michaelmas." Ledwin looked at his butler for a long moment. "You are a wicked old man. I learned it in service, Your Grace." Despite himself, something that was very nearly warmth moved behind the Duke's grey eyes and was gone. He crossed to the desk and took up the letter that had lain there 3 days, the letter that was the true weight on the house, though no servant knew its contents and he intended none should. It bore the seal of the Marchioness of Carroway, and inside it, in a hand as elegant and unhurried as its author, lay the confirmation that her daughter, the Lady Odalys Holloway, would honour the understanding between their houses and consent to become Duchess of Denstone in the spring. It was a good match. It was, in every particular that could be written down and totted up, an excellent match, land marching with land, name reinforcing name, and not one grain of feeling on either side to complicate the arithmetic. He had proposed it himself, by letter coolly, as one proposes a merger of estates, and Lady Odalys had accepted in the same spirit. Neither of them had once used the word love, and Ledwin considered this the single most sensible thing either of them had ever done. He had chosen it precisely because it could not hurt him. He folded the letter away and did not let himself examine why. At the sight of the thin girl carrying her own trunk through the rain, the excellent arithmetic of his life had felt, for one unwelcome instant, like a very cold thing to have built. Below, a door opened and shut, and he heard, faintly, through 2 floors of stone, the sound of the girl's voice in the servants' passage. He could not make out the words. But he heard the housekeeper's answer, Mrs. Penhallow, whose voice he had never once in 20 years heard soften for a soul, and it was not soft now either, only startled, and he thought he heard the girl thank her for something that had not been given warmly. A great house told its master everything if he listened, and Ledwin had made a study of listening, because a man who watched from behind glass need never be surprised. Yet he found he was already forming a picture of the newcomer he could not account for, a girl who thanked people for their coldness, who took the temperature of a room and warmed her hands at it anyway. She thanked the housekeeper, he said aloud, to no one, for Aldous had gone to the passage himself. He turned from the window and stood in the middle of the study, an unaccustomed restlessness moving in him. It was not a large thing. It was, he told himself, merely the discomfort of the unfamiliar, a new face in an old routine, a stone dropped in a still pond, the ripples of which would smooth in a day or two. He had felt it before, when a horse was brought that would not settle, when a steward brought accounts that did not reconcile. It was the feeling of a thing that did not yet fit the shape of his life. He would make it fit, or he would send it away. That was what a duke was for. But he did not sit down again, and he did not take up his correspondence, and when the clock on the mantel struck the hour he realized he had been standing at the cold hearth of thought for the better part of it, and had transacted nothing at all. "Bring her to me," he said, "after she has dried. I would look at what I am to be responsible for." She came an hour later, and she came alone, which surprised him. He had half expected a maid sent to make his apologies, a message of exhaustion, a plea to be received tomorrow. Instead, the door opened and Roswin Underhill stepped into the study and stood just inside it with her hands folded, and Ledwin, who had arranged himself behind the desk with the fire at his back, so that any visitor must face him half in shadow and half in glare, found that the arrangement did not seem to trouble her at all. She was not beautiful in the way the word was used at Caraway House. She was too pale and too thin, and her gown was 3 seasons out of any fashion, and her dark hair had been dressed simply because there had plainly been no one to dress it otherwise. But her eyes, when they found his, were steady and grey-green and entirely without fear, and she did not drop them, and she did not curtsy lower than courtesy required, and she did not smile the anxious, ingratiating smile of a poor relation come to beg. "Your Grace," she said, "I am told I am to thank you." "You are told correctly. I would not stop you." "Then I thank you," Roswin said, "for the roof and the fire and the trouble I am to you. I am sensible that I am a trouble. I would rather say so plainly at the start than have you think I do not know it." Ledwin leaned back in his chair. This was not the speech he had prepared to answer. He had prepared to answer gratitude or tears, or the sort of trembling gentility that made him want to leave the room. He had a dozen cold, dismissing replies ready, each one filed and sharpened. She had walked past all of them. "You are candid," he said. "I have found candor the cheapest thing I own, Your Grace, and the only one no one has yet taken from me." She said it without bitterness. That was the strange part, he would think later. There was no self-pity anywhere in her. No bid for his sympathy, only a plain accounting, as a woman might tell you the weather she had walked through. "My father owed a great deal to a great many, and to your father a debt of friendship he could never repay, and now that debt has come to you. I did not ask to be it. But here I am, and I mean to be as little a burden as a burden can be. Do you?" The Duke rose and came round the desk and looked down at her. He was a tall man, and used the height, and she came only to his shoulder and did not shrink from it. "Let me be as candid as you, Miss Underhill, since you value the coin. You will not ask here. I say it not to wound you, but because it is true, and I have watched it be true a dozen times. This is a hard house. It is cold and it is quiet, and the people in it are not kind, myself least of all. Girls of your circumstance come to Denstone thinking a great house is a soft place, and they find it is a stone one, and within a fortnight they weep to be sent to some cousin in Bath, who will at least speak to them at breakfast. You will do the same. I would not have you deceive yourself that you will not." He had said it deliberately hard, to see it land. He told himself, doing her a kindness. Better a cold truth now than a warm lie that cracked in a month. Roswin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long do you give me?" He had not expected the question, and it caught something in him, a flicker of the same feeling he'd had at the window, watching her lift the trunk. I beg your pardon. You have plainly wagered on it, your grace, in your own mind if nowhere else. A man does not speak so precisely of a fortnight unless he has counted the days already. I only ask what number you have set, so that I may know the mark I am to pass. Her chin lifted very slightly, for I do intend to pass it. Behind her by the door, Ledwin saw Aldous' shoulders go still with the effort of not reacting, and he was suddenly and absurdly aware that he had, in fact, wagered that the words had left his mouth not an hour before, "She won't last a week," and that this girl had read the whole of it off his face without being told a syllable. "A week," he said, because he would not lie to her. Some instinct he did not examine forbade it. "I said a week." A week. She turned the number over as if weighing it in her palm, and then she did something he did not expect. She smiled, not the ingratiating smile, not the wounded one, but a small, real, private thing, as though he had told her a joke that was mostly on himself. "Then I shall stay a week, your grace, and 1 day more, so that you may have the pleasure of being wrong at your own leisure. It is a small enough gift. It costs me nothing but the staying, and I am very good at staying. It is the thing I have had the most practice in." There was a silence in the study, and the fire filled it, and Ledwin, Duke of Denstone, who had entered the room certain of exactly how it would go, discovered that he did not know at all what to say next. He was a man who won conversations by not needing them. His weapon had always been that he cared less than the person across from him, and could therefore wait longer, and speak colder, and leave first. He looked at the thin girl in the outmoded gown who had just told him, without heat and without fear, that she intended to outlast his contempt out of something like courtesy, and he understood, with the particular unease of a man feeling the ground move under a house he had thought was built on rock, that he did not care less than she did. He was not even certain he cared less than he wished to. "You will find it a long week," he said, and it came out with none of the edge he had meant to put on it. "I have found most weeks long, your grace," Roswin said gently. "I have learned they end regardless." It struck him that she spoke of endurance the way other women spoke of dancing or of ribbons, as a thing she knew intimately from the inside and had made a kind of art of. He wondered, against his will, what she had endured to speak of it so easily. He did not ask. He had a rule, tested and kept against wondering aloud about anyone, because to ask a question was to confess an interest, and interest was the first small crack through which every other feeling flooded in. He had watched his own father drown that way, pouring himself out over a wife who spent it, then a woman who was not his wife, then the tables, then the bottle, until the great house that ought to have anchored him had merely watched him sink from its many warm windows. Ledwin had resolved to be the house and never the drowning man. He had been very successful at it. He had not known until this precise afternoon how much the resolution resembled being already, quietly hound in a manner that did not show. He should have dismissed her then. He meant to. He opened his mouth to say the words that would send her up to the cold blue rooms and out of his study and out, mostly, of his thoughts, and instead he heard himself say, "Why did you carry your own trunk? The footman would have brought it." She looked mildly surprised that he had seen. "Because he did not offer, your grace, and I did not wish to ask a man to do a thing he had already decided not to do. It shames him and delays me both. It was quicker to carry it." A pause. "And it was not heavy. There is very little in it. There is very little in it." He would hear the sentence again that night, lying awake, and be unable to say why it stayed with him when so much said to him by so many cleverer people slid off like the rain down the glass. There was very little in her trunk, and she had carried it herself rather than shame a servant, and she had walked into the coldest, hardest house in 3 counties and looked its master in the eye and promised to endure him 1 day longer than he thought she could, as a kindness, as a small enough gift. "That will be all, Miss Underhill," he said, and his voice had gone rough at some edge he could not find to smooth. "Aldous will show you up. Supper is at 8. You need not come down if you are tired." "I am never too tired to eat a supper someone else has cooked, your grace," she said, and there was that small private smile again, the one that seemed to include him in some warmth he had not agreed to. "I shall come down. A week and a day is a great many suppers. I should hate to begin by missing one." She curtsied exactly as low as courtesy required, not a hair lower unturned, and followed the butler out, and the study door closed behind her with its usual heavy, expensive quiet. Ledwin stood a long while by the fire after she had gone. Then he crossed to the window again, though there was nothing to see now but his own reflection floating on the black glass with the rain running through it, and he stood with the Marchioness's letter still warm in his coat where he had put it. The letter that had settled the whole cool, sensible future of his life, and he found that he was thinking not of Lady Audley's Holloway, whom he was to marry in the spring, but of a number. A week. He had said a week. He had wagered on a week aloud, before a witness, with all the flat certainty of a man who could not lose. For the first time in a very long time, the Duke of Denstone was not entirely sure he had bet on the right side. Supper at Denstone was served in a room built to humble kings, and Ledwin had never once thought of it as a cruelty until he watched Roswin Underhill walk into it at 8 o'clock precisely. The great dining hall ran the length of the east wing, a corridor of dark oak and dead ancestors, and down its centre stretched a table that could seat 40 and tonight seated 2. He had ordered it so on purpose, though he had told himself it was only habit. He sat at the head as he always sat, and Aldous had laid her place at the far end, a full 20 feet of polished walnut and cold silver between them, so that any word spoken must be carried the distance or not spoken at all. It was, he had thought when he gave the instruction, an efficient way to make a person feel her smallness without troubling to say a single unkind thing. Let the room do it. The room was very good at it. She came in unhurried in the same 3 seasons old gown, her dark hair still simply dressed. And she paused a half-step at the sight of the 2 lonely settings marooned at opposite ends of that great glittering plain, and Ledwin watched for the flush, the falter, the small wounded understanding of where she had been placed. It did not come. Instead, she looked at the 20 feet of table between them with something that was almost, he could not credit it, amusement, and then she crossed not to her own chair, but up the length of the room toward his, and stopped 3 seats down from him, and laid her hand on the back of that nearer chair. "Your Grace will forgive me," she said, "but I have a small confession. I cannot hear across water, and that table is very like a lake. If you mean to say anything to me at all this evening, we shall both be shouting like bargemen by the fish course, and I should hate for the footman to think we were quarrelling on my first night. May I sit here? I promise not to presume upon the closeness. I shall look at my plate a great deal." For a moment Ledwin said nothing, because he had again been handed a thing he had no reply filed for. He had built the whole tableau to be endured in silence, and she had simply dismantled it gently and asked his leave to do so, and made it sound like a courtesy to him. He was aware of Aldous by the sideboard, of the 2 footmen gone carefully blank, of the whole apparatus of the house waiting to see what its master would do with the impertinence. "Sit where you like," he said. "It is your funeral, Miss Underhill. You will find I am poor company at this end of the table as well as the other. Then we are matched," she said, drawing out the chair and settling into it with the neat economy of a woman long accustomed to taking up as little space as possible, "for I am poor company everywhere, and it has never once stopped me eating." And she unfolded her napkin and laid it across her lap and looked, for all the world, as though sitting 3 feet from the coldest man in 3 counties were the most natural arrangement imaginable. The soup came, and he waited for her to blunder, to reach for the wrong spoon, to speak out of turn, to tray in some small graceless way the poverty she had come out of. He was not proud of the waiting, but he did it, because it would have been easier to think her common. She did not oblige him. She ate quietly and correctly, and when the footman who had turned his back on her in the carriage court that afternoon set her plate down now with the barest suggestion of a sneer, she looked up at him and said, "Thank you, it is Peter." "Is it not?" And the young man started as though the chair had spoken, and mumbled that it was, and went away with his sneer entirely mislaid somewhere between the table and the door. "You know the footman's name," Ledwin said. "I asked Mr. Aldous on the stairs. It seemed a useful thing to know, since I am to see the man 3 times a day. A house is a great deal warmer, your Grace, when the people in it are willing to be called by their own names. It costs nothing." She turned her spoon in the soup. "Though I notice it is a coin your household spends very sparingly." He set down his glass. You have been here 5 hours, Miss Underhill, and you are already appraising my household. I have been appraising households my whole life, Your Grace. It is what a poor relation does. It is nearly the whole of her occupation. She arrives, and she learns very quickly who in the house will be kind to her and who will not, and she arranges herself accordingly, the way a plant leans toward whatever light there is. She said it without a trace of complaint, as a matter of natural science. You keep a cold house. I do not say it to reproach you. I only say it because you seem to me a man who would rather be told a thing than have it hidden, and because I would rather you heard my opinion of your house from me than imagine I had none. Ledwin looked down the length of the terrible glittering table and found, to his considerable annoyance, that he wanted to laugh. He did not. He had not laughed at his own table in longer than he cared to reckon. But the wanting was there, unfamiliar and unwelcome, and he covered it by reaching for the wine. "And what is your opinion of my house?" he said, "now that you have leaned toward what light there is?" "That it is a very great deal of light kept behind very heavy curtains," Roswin said, "and that the man who lives in it has arranged it all so that no one may come close enough to be a nuisance, and has succeeded so completely that no one may come close enough to be a comfort either. But that is not an opinion of your house, Your Grace. That is an opinion of you, and you did not ask for it, and I have overspent already." She dipped her spoon again, serene. "You may put it on my account. I shall be gone in a week and a day. You will have the whole sum back." There was a silence, and into it the fire cracked, and one of the footmen shifted his weight, and Ledwin sat with the extraordinary sensation of having been seen straight through by a woman who owned 2 gowns, and had eaten 5 suppers under his roof. He had spent 12 years making certain that no one at Denstone ever remarked upon the state of his heart, and he had done it so thoroughly that his own butler had stopped trying, and here was this thin, plain, penniless girl reading it aloud over the soup as though it were printed on the menu card. He ought to have been angry. He examined himself for the anger and found, in its place, only that same shifting under the ribs he had felt the window. The ground moving beneath the house he thought was rock. "You are impertinent," he said, but it had no weight in it. "I am honest, Your Grace," she said, which in a woman of no fortune the world is pleased to call impertinence, since it cannot call it charming. "If I had 10,000 a year you would call it wit. But I have not, so it is impertinence, and I shall try to ration it." She smiled the small private smile. "I find I cannot always. It is the other cheap thing I own." He thought unbidden of Lady Audley's Holloway. He thought of her because she was the exact opposite of the woman across the soup, and because thinking of her was a kind of ballast, a return to solid arithmetic. Lady Audley's was everything Roswin Underhill was not, golden, and gowned by the best hands in London, and possessed of a fortune that marched with his own like a well-drilled regiment, and Lady Audley's had never in his hearing said one true thing. She said the correct thing always, with a beautiful and untroubled ease. She praised what one was meant to praise and deplored what one was meant to deplore, and if you had asked her opinion of a cold house, she would have admired its proportions and said nothing whatever of its heart, because it would not have occurred to her that a house had one, or that its owner did. He had proposed to her precisely for that. A woman who would never look past his curtains could never be disappointed by what lay behind them, and could never, therefore, leave on account of it. He had chosen safety and named it sense, and yet, sitting at the head of his own table, he became aware that the whole cool machinery of that choice had begun, very faintly, to grind. That when he set the memory of Lady Audley's flawless indifference beside the memory of this girl, thanking a sullen footman by his name, the flawless thing had somehow come off the worse. It was not a comparison he had invited. He resented it. He had the distinct sense of a stone dropped into a well he had bricked over years ago, and the sound of it still falling. "You will find," he said, and his voice had gone cool again, deliberately, a man drawing a curtain, "that honesty is a poor currency in a house like this one. It buys nothing but enemies. You would be wiser to learn to say the pleasant, untrue thing, Miss Underhill. It is what the world rewards. It is what I intend to be surrounded by, quite soon and quite permanently, and I assure you the woman who has mastered it will never want for a warm chair." He had meant it as a warning and half as a wound, a reminder of her place, of the spring, of the golden untroubled duchess who was coming to take the head of this table. While Roswin Underhill was packed off to a cousin in Bath, he watched it land, waiting again for the flinch. And again she surprised him. She only looked at him for a long, steady moment with those grey-green eyes, and something in her face gentled, not with hurt, but with something perilously close to pity, and that he had not been prepared for at all. "I hope she is very kind to you, your grace," Roswin said quietly. "The woman who is coming. I hope she is kinder than she needs to be, and not only as kind as she is required. Because a man may live a long life on the pleasant, untrue thing, and never once be cold, and never once be warm either, and I have watched people do it, and I would not wish it on a dog, let alone on the man who has given me a roof I did not earn." She looked back to her plate. "There. I have overspent again. It is hopeless. You had far better send me up before I bankrupt myself entirely." But he did not send her up. That was the thing he would turn over afterward in the dark of the blue-shadowed corridor outside his own room, that he had had every reason and every opening to end the supper, to dismiss her, to restore the 20 feet of cold table and his own comfortable distance, and he had not done it. He had, instead, asked her another question, and then another. He had asked how she had passed the years since her father's ruin, and she had told him plainly, without a bid for sympathy, the small hired rooms, the sewing taken in, the 2 winters as a companion to an old lady in Harrogate who spoke to her only to complain and left her, at her death, precisely 1 mourning brooch and a Bible with the fly-leaf torn out. She told it as though it had happened to someone she was fond of but not overly sorry for. There was no self-pity in her anywhere. He kept looking for it the way one probes a tooth for the ache, and it simply was not there, and its absence was the most arresting thing about her. He had known great ladies made wretched by a rained-off garden party. Here was a woman who had been handed nothing but weather her whole life, and had learned to walk through it, and did not think herself owed the sun. Somewhere in the telling she turned the table on him, and did it so lightly he did not feel the handle move until it was done. "And you, your grace?" she asked, when he had pressed her once too often about the old lady in Harrogate. "You have had a good deal of my history for the price of a supper, and I begin to feel I am being robbed. It is only fair you should pay something into the account. Not much. 1 true thing. You may choose which." "I am not in the habit," he said, "of paying anything into anyone's account. It is how I have kept the account balanced." "Then you are very rich and very solitary, which is the most expensive way there is to be poor." She rested her chin on her hand, unhurried, as though they had all the winter before them. "1 true thing, your grace. I shall not carry it out of the house. I leave in a week. Whatever you tell me goes with me to Bath and dies there. There is no safer confessor in England than a woman who is about to disappear." And that, he thought afterward, was precisely how she had it out of him, not by pressing, but by promising to vanish. He looked at her across the 3 feet of table, this woman who would be gone before the first snow, and some door he kept shut with the whole weight of his life swung an inch on its hinge. "A woman left me," he said, 12 years ago, 3 weeks before we were to be married. She wrote it in 4 lines and did not sign her name, and the county knew before I did, so that I heard my own ruin from a man laughing about it at a card table. He heard his own voice, flat and even, describing the coldest fact of his life to a stranger over the ruins of a supper, and could not for his life have said why he was doing it. So you see, Miss Underhill, I am not a hard man by nature. I was made one, quite carefully, by an expert, and I have found the manufacture holds. That is your true thing. Do not spend it in Bath." He waited for the sympathy, the soft murmur, the tilted head, the pretty condolence that would have let him despise her a little and feel safe again. It did not come. She only looked at him with a grave and steady attention, as one looks at a wound to judge how deep it goes rather than to exclaim over it. "She did you a great wrong," Roswin said at last, "and then, I think, you did yourself a greater one, and you have gone on doing it for 12 years and called it wisdom. But I shall not scold you for it. A man is entitled to build whatever house he can bear to live in." A small pause. "I only hope you have left yourself a door, your grace. Even prisons have doors. It is what distinguishes them from tombs." He had no answer to that at all, and she did not seem to require one, and mercifully she let the subject fall, and asked him instead about the great blind portraits along the walls, and he found himself telling her which dead dukes had been scoundrels, and she laughed once, a low, real, unguarded sound that he felt somewhere beneath the sternum, and that the old hall had certainly not heard in a generation. The candles burned down. The footmen were long since dismissed. Only Aldous remained, motionless by the door, and Ledwin was distantly aware that his butler had not looked so nearly pleased in a decade, and he could not even summon the will to mind. "It is late," Roswin said at last, rising, "and I have talked you into a headache, which is a poor way to repay a supper. Thank you, your grace, truly, for the meal, and for letting me sit at your end of the lake, and for not sending me up when I deserved it, which I marked and shall remember." She curtsied exactly as low as courtesy required. 6 suppers left, and a day. "I begin to think I shall be sorry when they are gone. That was not in my plan at all." And she went, and the door closed, and Ledwin sat alone at the head of the vast table among the guttering candles, and did not move for a long while. "Aldous," he said finally, "your grace. Have the blue room chimney seen to tomorrow?" "I will not have it said I froze the girl to win a wager." He turned his glass slowly by the stem, watching the candlelight swim in the wine. "It would be an unsporting way to be right." "Very good, your grace." A pause, delicately weighted. "And if the chimney should draw, and the week should pass, and the young lady should still be here on the 8th day?" Ledwin did not answer at once. He was looking down the empty length of the table to the place 3 chairs from his own, where a woman with 2 gowns and no fortune had sat and told him the truth about his own house and pitied him for the golden future he had built to be safe in, and he found that he could still see her there, quite clearly, though the chair was pushed in and the candle beside it had gone out. "Then I shall have been wrong," he said, "and I shall pay it, and we will neither of us speak of it again." But that was not the truth, and he knew it even as he said it, and he suspected his butler knew it too. The truth was that he had sat down to supper meaning to measure a burden, and had risen from it unable to look away from her, and that a man who cannot look away from a thing has already, whatever he tells his butler, begun to lose the argument he is having with himself. The carriages came up the long drive at 4 o'clock, 2 of them, their lamps already lit against the early dark of the year, and Ledwin watched them from the same tall window where he had first watched Roswin Underhill lift her own trunk out of the rain. He told himself he was watching the road. He was a man who prided himself on telling the truth, at least inwardly, and so he made himself amend it. He was watching for the moment the great doors would open below and the household would arrange itself, and he was watching to see where, in that arrangement, one particular grey-green pair of eyes would come to rest. It was 5 days now. 5 of the 7 he had wagered, and she had not wept, and she had not sent word of exhaustion, and she had not begun to fade against the cold of the blue rooms as he had promised her she would. She had instead done the far more unsettling thing of simply continuing, coming down to every supper, thanking Mrs. Penhallow for civilities the housekeeper plainly had not intended as civilities, mending her own hems by candle rather than trouble a maid, and moving through his house so quietly that he had twice come upon her in a passage and felt, absurdly, as though he were the intruder in his own halls. He should not have arranged the dinner. He knew it even as the first carriage door was handed open and the Marchioness of Carroway descended in a rustle of dove-grey silk, one gloved hand rising to her cheek to test the air of Denstone as if for damp. He had told himself the invitation was a matter of course, that a betrothal between 2 such houses required, at some point before spring, that the ladies come to see the place they were to be joined to, and better in November when nothing was expected to please than in May when everything must. That was the reason he had given Aldous. It was even partly true, but he was aware, with the flat honesty he could not switch off, that some smaller and less admirable part of him had wished to set the 2 of them in one room, the woman he was to marry and the girl he could not stop watching, and to see, once and for all, how thoroughly the one would eclipse the other, and so put an end to the foolishness stirring in him. Lady Odalys Holloway came up the steps behind her mother, and she was, as she had always been, exactly as handsome as her letters. She was fair where Roswin was dark, and full where Roswin was thin, and dressed in a gown the colour of claret that had plainly cost more than everything in the Underhill trunk together and several trunks besides. She gave the hall the appraising, proprietary glance of a woman measuring a house for its faults, and she gave Ledwin, when he met her in the great hall, a smile that was cool and correct and asked nothing of him and offered nothing either, and he thought, with a satisfaction he distrusted the instant he felt it, that this was precisely why he had chosen her. Here was a face across which no feeling would ever ambush him. Here was safety dressed in claret. "Den Stone," she said, and gave him her hand. "The drive is longer than I remembered. You must find it a great deal of trouble to keep." "It keeps itself," he said. "I only pay for it." How fortunate. She was already looking past him up the stairs, along the gallery, pricing the pictures. "Mamma has been telling me the whole way that the house is grander than she recalled. I told her houses do not grow, only recollections." "Your recollection is welcome to correct itself at supper," he said, and offered his arm, and behind the Marchioness's shoulder, in the shadow at the foot of the stairs where the family were arranged to receive, he saw Roswin Underhill for the first time that evening, and forgot, for the length of a breath, what he had been about to say. She had done what she could. He saw the whole cost of it at a glance, because he had made a study of seeing what people wished to hide. She wore the best of her 3 gowns, the grey one, and she had trimmed it somehow at the throat with a narrow band of ribbon that had not been there before, and that he suspected she had unpicked from something older still, and she had dressed her own dark hair with a plainness that was, against the Marchioness's dove grey and her daughter's claret, very nearly severe. She looked like exactly what she was, a poor relation, brought down to make the numbers even, permitted at the table on sufferance. And she knew it, he could see she knew it. And she stood there under the full weight of that knowing, with her hands folded and her chin at its usual quiet angle, neither hiding nor pushing forward, simply present, the way a candle is present in a room of lamps. "And this," said the Marchioness of Carroway, arriving at her at last, "is Miss Underhill," Ledwin said, "my father's goddaughter. She is a guest of the house." He watched the word guest travel across the Marchioness's face and failed to find any purchase there. He watched her take in the grey gown and the unpicked ribbon and the plainness, and rearranged the girl in her mind from guest to something a great deal lower and more comfortable to place, and he watched her decide, in the space of a heartbeat, that Miss Underhill required no more of her attention than a good chair or a well-swept step. "How kind of you, Den Stone," the Marchioness said to Ledwin over Roswin's head. "Charity is such a becoming ornament in a bachelor. It will suit you less once you are married, of course. One cannot fill a house with strays. But for now it does you credit." She moved on toward the drawing-room without waiting to be answered, and her daughter followed, and neither of them had spoken a single word to the girl they had just discussed, and Roswin, who had heard every syllable, curtsied to their retreating backs precisely as low as courtesy required, and said nothing at all. Ledwin found that his jaw had set. He did not know when it had done so. He looked at Roswin, and she looked back at him, and there was in her face no wound that he could find, only a faint, private amusement, as if the Marchioness had said something more revealing than she knew, and Roswin was too well-bred to point it out. "You may go up, if you wish," he said low before he had decided to say it. "You need not endure the evening. I will make your excuse, and prove her ladyship right, your grace, that I am astray to be swept out of the way." Roswin's mouth curved, "That small real thing. No. I thank you, but I shall come in to supper. I find I am not so easily excused from a table. I have been turned away from a great many in my time. I have grown stubborn about the ones I am actually asked to." And she went in ahead of him, quietly, and took the place that had been laid for her. Below the salt, he saw far down the long table where the light of the branch candlesticks reached only thinly, a place that told every guest in the room exactly what she was worth, and she took it without a flicker, and spread her napkin, and thanked the footman who filled her glass, though the footman had not looked at her while he did it. The supper was long. Ledwin sat at the head of his own table with Lady Audley's at his right hand and the Marchioness at his left, and 8 other guests of the neighbourhood ranged between. And he performed the evening as he performed all such evenings, with a cold competence that passed for graciousness because no one present had ever seen the difference. He answered when spoken to. He carved when carving was wanted. He watched Lady O'Dolys turn the conversation expertly upon the coming season, upon who had let which house in town, upon a marriage lately broken off in a family 2 counties away. And he noticed, because he could not help noticing, that in an hour and a half of talk, not one person at the upper end of the table addressed a word to the lower, and that Roswin Underhill sat through the whole of it eating little and speaking less and finding, apparently, some genuine interest in the manners of a company that had unanimously agreed she did not exist. It should have satisfied him. He had wished to see her eclipsed, and here she was snuffed to a thread of candlelight at the wrong end of his own table, while the woman he was to marry shone in claret at the right. The arithmetic was plain. The eclipse was total. And Ledwin sat in the middle of his triumph and found it tasted of ashes, because every time the talk turned cruel, and Lady O'Dolys had a way of turning it cruel that was so smooth one might mistake it for wit, he found his eyes going, against all his discipline, down the long table to the quiet grey figure who bore it, and he found that he would rather have been down there in the thin light with her than up here in the blaze, and the discovery frightened him more than any he had made in years. It was Lady O'Dolys who at last, idly, the way one prods a fire out of boredom rather than need, turned her attention downward. "Miss Underhill," she said into a lull, and the whole table turned with her, surprised to be reminded there was a person there to be addressed. "You are come from, where was it? Some place in the west, Mamma said. You must find Denstone a very great change from your father's house." It was not a kind question. It was designed to make the girl name her poverty aloud before a room of strangers, or else be caught in a pretty lie, and Ledwin set down his glass, and did not know himself what he expected her to do. "A very great change, my lady," Roswin said, in her clear, plain voice, and the light down there caught her at last as she lifted her head. "My father's house was small and much in want of repair, and cold in a way this house is not, for the wind came in at the windows there directly, whereas here it must travel a great distance and arrives quite tamed." A ripple of uncertain amusement went round the table. They did not know whether they were permitted to be entertained. "But there is one particular in which the 2 houses are exactly alike, and it has been a great comfort to me." "And what is that?" said Lady O'Dolys, who had expected shame and received composure, and did not care for the exchange. "In both," Roswin said, "a person may sit a long while at the foot of the table and learn a very great deal about the people at the head of it, who imagine, because she is quiet, that she is not listening. It is the poor relation's whole education, my lady. We are the best informed people in England. No one thinks to guard their tongue before the furniture." The silence that followed was of a very particular kind, and Ledwin, who had heard 1,000 silences at his own table, and could read each one, read this one perfectly. It was the silence of a room that has just understood it has been overheard all evening by someone it had agreed to treat as deaf. Lady O'Dolys's colour rose high and quick along her handsome cheek. The Marchioness's fan stopped, and Ledwin, Duke of Denstone, felt something break open in his chest that he had no name filed for at all, a hot, wholly disreputable urge to laugh, and beneath it deeper, a thing that was closer to pride than he had any right to feel on behalf of a girl he had promised 5 days would run within the week. He did not laugh. He said, into the ruin she had made so gently, "Miss Underhill has the advantage of us all. She has spent her life learning, while we have spent ours being learned. I would not cross her at cards." And he turned the talk smoothly back to the safe country of the London season, and the company followed him gratefully, and the moment closed over like water. But he had said "we," and he had set the girl at the foot of the table above the whole of the head of it, and he saw Lady O'Dolys understand that he had done so, and saw her file it, cool and correct, in whatever ledger she kept. The ladies withdrew. The gentlemen sat over their wine, and Ledwin bore it, and when at last he could decently end the evening he did, and the carriages were called for 10, and the Marchioness of Carroway pronounced the hall grander than she had recalled, and the supper better than she had feared, and the goddaughter. She said this last on the very step, drawing on her glove, not troubling to lower her voice. A singular sort of creature, Denstone, Who would want watching if she stayed, being of the kind that did not know its place and might presume upon a kindness? And Lady Odalys gave him her cool hand and her cool correct smile and said she would write, and did not once look back down the hall to where the singular creature stood in the shadows seeing them off, and the doors closed on the cold, and the great house was quiet again. Roswin was gathering the 2 candlesticks the footman had left to snuff, because it was late and she would not make a servant climb for them. Ledwin came upon her doing it in the dim hall, and she looked up unstartled, and he found he did not want to let her go up the stairs without saying the thing that had been sitting in him since the foot of the table. You should not have done it, he said, what you said at supper. It was unwise. Lady Odalys will not forget it. No, Roswin agreed, lifting a candlestick. She will not. But I was not speaking to be forgotten, your grace. I was speaking to be true, which is a different aim and answers to a different master. She studied him a moment in the low light, and then she said gently, as though she were the one who had watched him all evening and not the reverse, "You did not defend me because I was in danger." I was in no danger. The worst that could befall me tonight was to be ignored, and I have survived being ignored a great many years. It is quite tolerable, once one stops expecting otherwise. You defended me because you could not bear to sit in that chair and be one of them. That is a different thing. That is not for my sake at all, your grace, it is for your own. Ledwin stood very still. No one spoke to him so. In 15 years as Duke of Denstone, no one, not Aldous, who came nearest, not his steward, not his own confessor, had looked at him across the ruin of and heaved him, plainly and without fear, the exact truth of his own heart, a truth he had not yet dared tell himself. "You presume, Miss Underhill," he said, heard how thin it came out. "I do," she said, without apology. "It is the poor relation's other education. We learn to read the head of the table, your grace, because our supper depends upon its mood." She set the second candlestick under her arm. "You are lonely in that chair. I saw it the first night, and I have seen it every night since. You have built yourself a very fine cold house and married yourself, or nearly, to a very fine cold future, and you sit at the head of it all quite alone, and you tell yourself it is safety. I know the look of it because I have worn a smaller version of it myself. I only think it is a great pity in a man who is capable, as you were tonight for one moment, over the wine of a great deal of warmth, that he should spend so much strength keeping it hidden. That is all. Good night, your grace. 4 days remain. I intend to be here for each of them." She curtsied exactly as low as courtesy required and not a hair lower, and carried her stolen candlesticks up the great dark stair, the little flames throwing her shadow long and wavering against the stone. And Ledwin stood alone in the cold hall and did not, for once, watch her go from behind any glass at all, but with his own naked eyes, until the last of her light had turned the landing and gone. Then he went up to his own rooms, and did not ring for anyone, and undressed himself in the dark like a poorer man, and lay along while listening to the great house tick and settle around him, and to the wind that must travel so far to reach these windows, and arrived at last, as she had said, quite tamed. He thought of Lady Odalys's cool, correct smile that asked nothing of him, and found it gave him no comfort at all tonight. He thought of the Marchioness's word, stray, and of the ribbon unpicked from something older to trim a throat for a supper where no one would look. He thought of a voice at the foot of his table dismantling the whole head of it in 3 quiet sentences, for no gain to herself, out of nothing but a refusal to be untrue. He was a man who had spent 15 years learning not to want things, because wanting was the crack through which the flood came in. He lay in the dark and felt precisely how much he was coming to want, and so he did what he had always done. He drew the old reserve back over himself like a counterpane, and resolved that in the morning he would be cooler with her, and set a proper distance, and remember that in 4 days she would in all likelihood be gone regardless, and that a wise man did not grieve a thing before he had lost it. It was a good resolution. He kept it precisely until he closed his eyes, at which point behind them, quite without his leave, there was only the grey gown and the lifted chin and the small, private smile that seemed to include him in some warmth he had never once, in all his careful life, agreed to. And the Duke of Denstone, who could not stop thinking of her, lay awake in his cold and famous house, and could not remember why he had ever thought the arithmetic of it was enough. The 8th day came in on a hard bright frost, and the Duke of Denstone lost his wager. He lost it not in any single scene, for she made no scene. She simply appeared at breakfast on the morning she had promised she would still be there, in the second of her 2 gowns. And she wished him a good morning and remarked that the frost had silvered the whole park in the night, as though someone had gone over it with a jeweller's brush, and she buttered her toast, and she was there. That was all the winning of it amounted to. She did not name the wager or count the day aloud or look him in triumph. She left the whole of the reckoning to him, and it was that, the sheer, quiet, ungloating factor still sitting at his table when every other girl in 12 years had wept and fled, that he found over his coffee. He could not stop turning in his hands. He waited until Roswin had gone up, and then he took a sovereign from his waistcoat and set it on the sideboard beside the coffee pot, where Aldous stood. "You did not wager, your grace," the butler observed. "I wagered with myself, which is the only game I ever lose at, being both parties to it." He looked at the coin, gold on the dark wood, put it toward the girl's keep. "She will not take a shilling from me directly. I have tried on the matter of gloves. She thanked me and mended her old ones, but she cannot refuse what she does not know she has been given. See, she is warm, Aldous. See, there is coal enough in the blue rooms that she need not sit in her cloak indoors and pretend to me at supper that she does it from habit." "Very good, your grace." A pause, in which the old man permitted himself the smallest possible easing of the mouth. "Then your grace was wrong." "Your grace was wrong," Ledwin agreed, and found, to his surprise, that the admission cost him nothing at all, and warmed him rather, as though he had put down a weight he had been carrying so long he had ceased to feel its cutting. "See that you do not grow accustomed to hearing it. It is a frost that will not come twice in a season." But it did come again, in a manner of speaking, for the 8th day passed and she did not go, and there was no cousin-in-Bath summoned and no carriage ordered. And by unspoken agreement between the master of the house and the girl who had beaten his prophecy, the subject of her leaving was allowed simply to lapse, the way an unpaid debt lapses when both parties have resolved never to call it in. December settled over Denstone with its short blue days and its long amber evenings, and Roswin Underhill one being there, and Ledwin discovered, by degrees so small he could pretend for a while not to be charting them, that the being there had become the shape his days were poured into. He would not have called it seeking her out. He was too careful a man to have called it that, even to himself. But he found that he took his morning ride later than had been his custom for 20 years, because it was later that she walked in the walled kitchen garden, muffled to the ears, learning the names of the winter things from old Trevor the gardener as she had learned the footman's, and he found that he had begun to bring his correspondence into the small library rather than the study, because the small library caught the afternoon sun, and it was there, at that hour, that she sat with whatever book she had unearthed from the great neglected shelves, reading with a stillness and a hunger that made him ashamed, obscurely, of every unread yard of morocco and gilt his family had bought by the wall length and never once opened. It was in the small library, on an afternoon when the light was already going gold and thin at 4 o'clock, that the thing between them came nearest, at last, to a word. He had been at the long table with his letters, and she in the window seat with a volume open on her knees. And neither had spoken for the better part of an hour, and the silence had not been the cold silence he had built his life to keep, but another kind entirely, a silence like a hearth, that 2 people may sit inside of and be warmed by without speaking. He had grown so unused to it that he kept mistrusting it, glancing up to see whether she meant to break it with some demand, and each time finding her only bent to her page with the low sun in her dark hair, and turning back to his letters strangely eased. Then the light failed by that last quick degree it fails at in December, and she made a small sound of protest at losing it, and he rose without thinking and brought a candle to her window seat and set it on the sill. And in the leaning to set it down his hand and hers came near together on the cold stone, near enough that he felt the warmth of her fingers before he touched them, and did not touch them, and stopped. With the candle between them and the little flame doubling in her grey-green eyes as she looked up, neither of them moved. It was the length of 3 heartbeats, perhaps no more, but Ledwin, who had spent a dozen years perfecting the art of not being reached, felt every wall he owned go thin as paper in the space of it, and knew, with the plain terror of a man watching the tide come over ground he had thought above the water, that if he bent the last inch he would not be able to unbend it afterward, not for all the arithmetic in England. He straightened. He took his hand away, he said, because he had to say something, and it was the safest true thing he could find. What are you reading, that you should quarrel with the sun for taking it? Poems. She let the moment go as gently as she let everything go, without snatching at it, without pretending it had not been there. Your great-grandfather's. I think his name is in the front, at least in a very proud hand. He has written verses to a lady's eyebrow, and they are dreadful, and I have never in my life been so happy over anything. She smiled up at him, and there was a brightness on her that the candle did not account for. I have not had books, you see, not for years. Books are the first thing one sells and the last thing one can bear to. To sit in a house that has thousands of them and nobody minds if I read is, I had not thought to have it again. I find I am greedy. I sit here till I cannot see, and then I light a candle and go on, and I have begun to dream in other people's sentences. She closed the dreadful poems over her finger. You will think me a very poor sort of guest who is glad of your dead relation's bad verse and cold coal and nothing else. I think, Ledwin said carefully, that I have never watched anyone be glad of anything before. Not truly. The people I have known are glad of things the way they are cold or warm, as a report they make to be believed. You are glad of a book the way a fire is glad of a log. It is a different thing entirely. I am not certain I had a word for it until this week. She was quiet a moment, turning the little book in her hands. You had it once, I think, she said. The gladness, before the lady and the 4 lines. A man does not build a wall so high and so careful unless he is walling in something he knows to be worth the stealing. It is only the men with something precious who ever bother to bar the doors. She looked up at him, grave now, the smile gone soft into something steadier. I have wondered, you need not answer, what she took that you have spent 12 years making certain no one could take again. Not your pride. Pride mends. It is the toughest thing we own. Something under the pride. He should have drawn the curtain then. He had the words ready. Some cool deflection, some dukely closing of the subject, and he found, standing over her with the candle burning between them and the dark coming up blue in the corners of the room, that he did not want them, and had not wanted them for days, and was so tired of wanting them. She took my belief that I could tell, he said low, which of the faces turned toward me meant it. I had thought myself a clever man, Miss Underhill. I had thought I could read a room, a hand of cards, a marriage, the way a steward reads a ledger, that there was no sum I could not balance if I only kept my head. And then a woman I would have staked my life on looked at me every day for a year with love in her face, and meant a fortune and a warmer bed the whole while, and I did not see it, not a flicker. The county saw it, my groom saw it. I, who prided myself on seeing everything, saw nothing at all, because I did not wish to. He heard his own voice go rough and let it. So I resolved never again to stake anything on my own reading of a face. It is a safer life. One cannot be made a fool of over a thing one has declined to want. That is the whole of my wisdom, and it has served me 12 years, and I have never once, until this fortnight, found it wanting. Roswin did not exclaim, and did not pity him, and did not, he watched for it, take the smallest advantage of what he had laid down. She only sat with it, the way she sat with everything, giving it its full weight. Then you were robbed of the worst thing there is to lose, she said at last, which is not the person. It is the trust of your own heart to know its own mind. That is a cruel theft, your grace, and I am sorry for it, more than I have been sorry for a great many losses of my own. She set the little book aside. But I will tell you what I have learned, who have also been taught not to trust, though by hunger rather than by any lady, which is a plainer teacher. A heart that has been fooled once is not blind ever after. It is only frightened. And a frightened man tells himself he cannot see, because it excuses him from looking. But you see perfectly well. You saw a footman sneer, and you saw me carry my own trunk, and you have seen, I think, a great deal this fortnight that you would rather not have. You are not a man who cannot read a face, your grace. You are a man who has forbidden himself to trust what he reads. They are not the same affliction, and only one of them is a wound. The other is a habit, and habits, unlike wounds, we may choose to set down. The candle flame stood straight and small in the still air between them, and Ledwin looked at her for a long moment, and felt the ground he had bricked over so carefully move again beneath his feet, further this time, a whole slow shelf of it giving way. "You speak of your losses," he said, because it was safer, just barely, than speaking of his own, as though they were many and old, and you had made your peace with all of them, but you were a child when your father fell. What has a woman of 25 lost, to speak of losing the way you do, as a thing she knows from the inside? My mother, when I was 9, Roswin said simply, off a fever that took her in a week, so that I learned young how quickly the whole of a warm house may go cold. My father, by inches, over years, he grew gentle and useless where a harder man grows hard. Our house, our name, which had meant something in 3 counties, and now means only a debt in yours. Every friend who was a friend of the money and not of the girl, which is nearly all of them. The expectation of ever being anything but a burden in another person's house, that I lost latest, and it is the one I miss most, for it is a lonely thing to know oneself always the visitor and never the daughter. Always the woman who must be glad of the coal and careful of the account. She said it all in that even, unpitying voice, laying each loss down like a case up, asking nothing. But do you know, your grace, I have found that a person who owns nothing has one freedom the rich are strangers to. I cannot be robbed of my fortune, for I have none. I cannot be married for my land. When someone is kind to me, I know past all doubting that it is myself they are kind to, since there is nothing else of me to want. It is a cold sort of freedom, but is the only one I have ever owned outright, and I would not trade it, even now, even here. She looked up at him, and something wavered in the steadiness for the first time since he had known her. Even where I have begun, against every scrap of my own good sense, to be glad of more than the books, it hung there in the dying light, that admission, further than either of them had gone, and Ledwin felt it strike him clean through the 12 years of careful stone. Felt it in the place under the pride she had named, the place he had walled up and mortared over and half forgotten he still owned. And he opened his mouth, not knowing in the least what he meant to say, only that it would be true, and that it would be the end of the safe, cold, sensible arithmetic of his whole life, and that he no longer cared. And the door of the small library opened, and Aldous came in with a lamp and a letter on a salver, and the moment shut like a book. "Forgive me, your grace." The butler's voice was carefully without expression, but Ledwin, who had learned to read him over 20 years, saw the thing at once in the set of the old man's shoulders, saw that the letter mattered, and that Aldous was sorry it had come. From Caraway House. The messenger waits upon a reply. He was bidden not to leave without one. Ledwin took it. He knew the seal before he broke it, and the elegant unhurried hand within, and he read it standing over the candle he had brought to Roswin's window, with Roswin not 3 feet from him in the deepening dark, and the words of it fell on him like cold water flung from a great height. The Marchioness of Caraway presented her compliments, and was pleased to inform his grace that she and her daughter, the Lady Odalys Holloway, would do themselves the honour of coming to Denstone within the fortnight, that Lady Odalys might see the house that was so soon to be her own, and meet the household she was to command, and that the 2 families might, over a senight's visit, settle those particulars of the spring wedding which were more agreeably arranged in person than by post. They looked forward, the Marchioness wrote, to finding all in readiness. Ledwin read it twice. Then he was aware of the small library around him once more, of the candle he had carried for her, of the great shelves of books she was greedy for, of the window seat where she sat now very still, and of the whole warm, unsanctioned, undeniable thing that had grown up in this room over a fortnight of gold afternoons and would, in 14 days, have to stand in the same house as the golden, untroubled future he had chosen, so that it could never be touched. "Your Grace," Roswin said quietly. He could not see her face for the dark, only the shape of her, and the candle catching one edge of her cheek. "Is it ill news?" "No," he said, and the word came out of him like a stone. "It is a wedding." "Mine." He folded the letter along its creases with hands that he was distantly furious to find were not quite steady. "Lady Odalys Holloway comes to Denstone within the fortnight, with her mother, to see the house she is to be mistress of. They will stay a week. I must send word to have the state rooms opened." He looked up and found her eyes in the gloom, and could not for his life read what was in them, and understood in that instant that hers was the one face in all the world he now most desperately, most helplessly, wished to be able to read, and that he had forfeited by 12 years of careful blindness the very art that might have let him. "You will meet her," he said. "You will find her everything the world could ask. I told you she was coming. I told you at the very first supper." "You did," Roswin said. Her voice was perfectly steady. It was the steadiness. He thought of a woman who has had long practice in being glad of the call and careful of the account, and knows to a nicety the moment when a visitor is reminded that she is only, after all, the visitor. "I remember it very well." She rose from the window seat, and gathered the dreadful little book of poems, and stood a moment with it held against her, and the candle he had carried for her burned between them still. "I hope she is kind to you, your grace. I hope it more than ever I did. Now, if you will excuse me, you have a reply to write, and a house to open, and I have kept you from both, and that is no way for a guest to earn her call." She curtsied exactly as low as courtesy required, not a hair lower, and it undid him more than any weeping could have. "Good evening." And she went, and the door closed, and Ledwin, Duke of Denstone, stood alone over a guttering candle with a letter in his hand that ordered the whole cold, sensible future of his life to arrive within the fortnight, and knew, past all his arithmetic and all his walls, that somewhere in the last 14 golden days he had stopped wanting it, and that he had left himself, exactly as she had warned him a man should not, without a door. The 7th day came and went, and the Duke of Denstone said nothing of the wager, because to name it now would have been to concede he had lost it. Roswin Underhill was still beneath his roof on the morning of the 8th day, and on the 9th, kneeling in the blue rooms to mend a torn valance the last 3 governesses had left to rot, as though she meant to be carried out of Denstone feet first at the end of a long and useful life. Aldous did not remind him of the terms. Aldous had a gift for silences, and this one had the particular quality of a man who has watched a contest end, and is too discreet to announce the winner to the loser's face. Ledwin told himself he was glad the thing was closed. He had, in the days since the storm-lit hour in the library, the hour he did not permit himself to number among his memories, though it lay at the top of the pile regardless, the way the newest coin lies at the top of the purse, he had drawn the old reserve back over himself with a will. He had been cool with her at supper. He had addressed his remarks to the middle distance. When she came upon him in a passage, he had inclined his head the precise degree owed a dependent and no degree more, and had walked on with his blood going like a mill race and his face arranged into the marble everyone at Denstone knew and feared. It had cost him a great deal, and he had mistaken the cost for virtue as frightened men will. For Lady Audley's Holloway was coming to fix the date. That was the plain fact under all the rest of it, the beam that carried the roof. Their engagement had been arranged the winter before by 2 solicitors and a shared boundary of some 3,000 acres, and it was, everyone agreed, an admirable thing, a cool correct union of 2 cool correct houses, requiring nothing of either party but that they continue as they had always been. She asked nothing of his heart. That had been, when the papers were signed, precisely its recommendation. A man who had spent 15 years learning not to want could not have designed a safer harbour than a woman who did not want him to want her. She arrived on the 10th day in a travelling chariot with her arms full of hothouse lilies. She had brought from her own succession houses to show what Denstone's gardens lacked, and behind her came her mother, the Marchioness, whose word for Roswin, stray, had lodged under Ledwin's ribs a fortnight ago and had not worked itself loose. The 2 ladies swept through his hall assessing the plate. A betrothal supper was got up for that same evening, the long table opened to its fullest leaf, the county summoned at short and flattering notice. And the Duke of Denstone stood at the head of his own board that night in the certainty that he was doing the correct and orderly thing, and felt, under the certainty, a cold he could not name and would not look at. Roswin was seated where a dependent was seated, far down the board among the lesser gentry, in the grey gown with the ribbon unpicked from something older to trim its throat. She did not perform. She did not flatter the Marchioness nor angle for the notice of the men. She answered when addressed, praised the fish, and passed the salt with the honoured grace of a woman entirely at peace with being overlooked, and Ledwin from his height at the table's head with Lady Audley's correct and gleaming at his right hand. found his eyes going down the long candlelit run of it to the plain grey figure at the foot as a compass needle goes to the north, helplessly, and against every resolution he had made, the Marchioness marked it. She had the huntress's instinct for the one wound in the room, and she had been watching her daughter's intended betray himself over the soup. "You keep an unusual household, Denstone," she said, into a lull in the carrying voice of a woman who intends to be overheard. "One hears the strangest things of it in town, that you have taken in a connection. A young person of no particular family, out of some charity or other." She let the word charity sit a moment. "It is thought eccentric. A man on the eve of his marriage, harbouring a pretty stray with no name to speak of and no portion at all. People will talk, you know. They are talking. For Odalis's sake, if not your own, one hopes you mean to see the creature suitably placed before the wedding and out from underfoot." The table went quiet in the way a table does when it scents blood and pretends to study its plate. Lady Odalis said nothing. She wore a cool, correct smile and waited, as her mother's daughter, to see what her property was worth. And Ledwin felt every eye come to rest on him, and understood, with perfect clarity, that this was the moment. That one word from him would settle it. He had only to say what was true, that Miss Underhill was a gentlewoman of more quality than half the titles at his board. That she had endured his own coldness with a grace that shamed him. That she was not a stray, nor a creature, nor a charity, but the single honest soul under his roof, and that he would thank the Marchioness not to speak of her so at his table. It would have cost him nothing. It would have cost him only the admission, before witnesses, that she mattered, and that was the one price the Duke of Denstone could not pay. For 15 years he had built his whole guarded life upon knowing that to let the world see what you loved was to hand the world the map to your ruin. His mother had loved openly and been left. His father had loved openly and gone into the ground broken by it. Ledwin had watched a boy behind a banister and had resolved that no living creature would ever again be able to unmake him by the simple expedient of being loved and lost. To defend Rosewin now in this company was to raise the map and point to the treasure. So he did the thing his whole armoured history had trained him to do. He set his wine down, and he was very cold, and he said in the marble voice, "You need not concern yourself, madam. Miss Underhill is a temporary arrangement of my late steward's making. She will be provided for and placed in the ordinary way as one places any dependent. She is nothing that need trouble the household or the marriage." He heard the words leave him and he could not call them back. A temporary arrangement, nothing that need trouble. He had reduced her out loud at his own table before 30 faces to a line in a ledger and a problem to be tidied away. He, who 3 nights past had stood with her in the stormlight and been more truly seen and more truly warmed than in the whole cold decade before her coming. The Marchioness smiled, satisfied. Lady Odalis inclined her sleek head, satisfied. The table breathed again and returned to its fish, satisfied. He had done the correct and orderly thing, and the room approved him for it. He made himself look down the length of the board. Roswin was not weeping. She was not flushed. She had set down her fork with the same unhurried grace with which she did everything, and she was looking back at him quietly, steadily, the whole length of the candlelight between them, and it was not reproach in her face, which he could have borne, and it was not anger, which he could have answered. It was recognition. It was the still, sorrowing look of a woman who has just watched a man she had begun, against her own better judgment, to hope for, choose the safety of his fear over the truth of her, and who understands in that instant, completely and without illusion, exactly what he is, and exactly what he is not yet able to be. She held his eyes for the length of one long breath. Then she lifted her chin the familiar fraction, and turned to her neighbour, and asked him some small kind question about his journey, and was, from that moment, perfectly composed for the remainder of the evening, which was, Ledwin would understand far too late. The sound of a door closing so softly that only the two of them heard it shut. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark of his famous cold house and told himself, over and over, in his father's voice and his own, that he had done what was sensible, that a betrothed man could not go about championing penniless girls at his own table, that she was a temporary arrangement in sober fact, and that the ache under his ribs was merely the discomfort of the unfamiliar, and would smooth in a day or two as ripples smooth in a pond. He had used that very thought about her the first morning, at the window, watching a footman turn his back on her in the rain. He found it comforted him no better now than it had then. Twice he rose and went to the window and looked down the black avenue toward the lodge, and twice he told himself he was merely restless, and twice he knew he was lying, and lay down again in the dark, and stared at the canopy and saw, behind his closed eyes and quite without his leave, the still sorrowing recognition in a plain grey face at the foot of a long table, the look of a woman who had stopped hoping for him in the middle of a fish course, and had done it so quietly that no one in the room but he had heard the door go. She came to him the next morning in the study and asked, with perfect civility, for a quarter of an hour of his time. He granted it from behind his desk, armoured, braced for the scene, for the tears, the reproaches, the trembling appeal to what had passed between them, all the weapons a clever dependent had at her disposal against a man who had wronged her and knew it. He had already composed his cool refusals. He would be kind but firm. He would not be moved. She did not give him the chance to be any of it. "I have come to thank you, Your Grace," Roswin said, standing very straight before the desk in the grey gown, her hands folded and quiet, "and to take my leave. A letter reached me 3 days since, which I have this morning answered and accepted. You will recall I once kept the schoolroom and the account books both in my father's parish before his death left me with neither. It seems the memory of it outlasted him. Mrs. Trevanion, who keeps a school for girls of good family at Bath, a friend of my late mother's, and no charity of anyone's, finds herself in want of a teacher of letters and figures and a steady hand over the younger pupils. She has offered me the place and a salary and a room of my own with a window that faces the road. I mean to earn my bread with the 2 things God gave me the wit for, and to owe it to no one. I leave in the morning." Ledwin sat very still. "You have accepted a post," he said, "as a schoolmistress." "I have accepted a life, Your Grace," she said, gently. "That is my own. It is not a grand one. But it will be mine, got by my own merit and kept by my own work, and no marchioness in England may call it charity, 'cause it will not be. I have wanted only that, I think, since I came here, not to be provided for and placed and tidied out from underfoot, but to stand somewhere on my own 2 feet and be of use." She paused. "You offered me a wager that first day, though you supposed I did not know of it. You wagered I should flee within the week. I did not flee. I stayed a fortnight, and I outlasted your 7 days, and I am not fleeing now. I am simply going, which is a different thing entirely, and I go in the daylight with my head up and my trunk packed by my own hands. I should like you to understand the difference. I think it matters." She was giving him, he understood, one last thing he had not earned the chance. The door stood not quite latched even now. She had laid out before him, without one word of appeal, the whole plain shape of what she was. A woman who could keep a schoolroom and an account book and her own dignity all at once, who asked for nothing, who had endured his house and his coldness and his public unkindness, and was leaving it not broken but risen. And all he had to do was reach across the desk and say the one true sentence he had swallowed at supper: "Stay. Not as a dependent. Not as an arrangement. Stay, because I cannot do the arithmetic of my life without you in it any longer, and I have been a coward, and I am sorry." The words were in him. He felt them, whole and ready, pressing at the back of his teeth, and the old fear rose up and took him by the throat, the fear of the boy behind the banister, and he heard himself say instead, in the level voice that had frightened stronger people than she, "I see. Then there is nothing further to arrange. You will permit me to provide the carriage, at least, and a sum toward your settling. It is the least owed a dependent who has given no trouble." Something in her face closed, the last small light of it, the thing she had held open a breath longer than he deserved, and went quietly out. "No, Your Grace," she said. "Thank you. I will hire the stage from the village, and I will take nothing from this house but what I brought into it, and a little more warmth of memory than I expected to carry away. I find I would rather owe you nothing at all, even kindness. Especially kindness." She curtsied, exactly as low as courtesy required, and not a hair lower, as she had curtsied to him in this very room the day she came. "I hope you will be very happy in your marriage. I mean that truly. Goodbye, Ledwin." It was the only time she had ever used his name, and she used it as one lays a thing down that one is finished carrying. Then she turned and let herself out, and the heavy study door closed behind her with its usual expensive quiet, and the Duke of Denstone sat alone at his desk in the grey November light and did not move for a very long while, and told himself that the room felt exactly as it always had. She left at first light, and the whole house that never once softened for a soul in 20 years turned out into the carriage court to see her go. Ledwin, standing at the tall study window where he had first watched her arrive, saw it all through the glass, as he saw everything, from behind the safe cold pane that had been his whole life's post. He saw Mrs. Penhallow, whose voice he had never heard soften, press a wrapped parcel of bread and cold fowl into Rosewin's hands and turn sharply away to hide her face. He saw Aldous, who had wagered against her at that very window a fortnight past, carry her single trunk down himself and hand her up into the hired trap with the grave courtesy he reserved for duchesses. He saw 2 of the housemaids weeping frankly, and the footman who had turned his back on her the first day now standing bareheaded in the cold with his cap in his hands. He saw her look up, once at the great grey face of the house, not searching the windows, not hoping, simply taking her leave of the whole of it, and he stepped back out of habit, out of fear, so that she should not see him behind the glass. Then the trap went down the long avenue under the bare dripping limes, smaller and smaller, and turned at the lodge and was gone. The Duke of Denstone stood at his window a while longer, and watched the empty avenue, and waited for the ripples to smooth as he had promised himself they would. He had done, he told himself, the correct and orderly and sensible thing. His engagement was safe, his house was quiet, his name was undamaged. A temporary arrangement had concluded itself in the ordinary way, and a wise man did not grieve a thing he had never truly possessed. He believed it, that morning standing behind the glass in the house that had never felt so much like mausoleum. He believed it because he did not yet know how to reckon what had just left him, did not yet understand that some losses do not announce themselves at the door, but come home slowly, over empty suppers and unwatched passages and long grey mornings at a cold window, until a man wakes one day into the full and killing knowledge of what he held and mocked, and let walk out into the daylight with her head up and her trunk in her own 2 hands. That knowledge was coming for him. But it had not yet arrived, and so the Duke turned from the window and rang for Aldous, and asked in a level voice what there was to attend to, as though this were any morning, as though the North had not just walked out of his compass forever, and the great house ticked and settled around him, and did not tell him this once the one thing he most needed to know. It arrived in the end, not as a blow but as a subtraction, the way the cold comes into a room after a fire has been let die, not felt at the moment of neglect but discovered an hour on, as a chill in the bones that will not be reasoned away. The Duke of Denstone went about the first day as he had promised himself, level and orderly, and found the order strangely thin, like ice a man knows will not bear his weight though it has borne it every winter of his life. He rode out and came back. He signed what Aldous set before him. He dined at 8 at the head of the long table, and it was only when he had sat some while over the soup that he understood he had been listening, without knowing it, for a light step in the passage, for the small particular sound of a person who moved through his house as though grateful to it, and had heard nothing, and would hear nothing, and had been waiting on that nothing, like a man at a window watching a road down which no trap would ever come. He put down his spoon. The great room went on glittering emptily about him. The plate she had once said made his hall look like a jeweller's shop and not a home. The fire she was not there to sit beside, and he sat in the middle of his own magnificence and felt, for the first time in 15 careful years, precisely and unmistakably poor. He had thought grief, if it came, would come loudly, and could therefore be met and mastered as he met and mastered every loud thing. It did not come loudly. It came in the passages. He found her everywhere she was not. He came upon the blue rooms and saw the valance she had mended hanging straight and whole where 3 governesses had left it to rot, the small even stitches of a woman who did work no one would praise, because it was right that it be done, and he stood in the doorway a long time and could not go in. He opened the estate ledgers and found, tucked at the back where Aldous had said nothing of it, a fair copy of the tenant accounts in a clear round hand that was not Aldous', the figures ruled and totalled, and a gentle marginal note against the widow Cardew's arrears. She has had a bad year and a worse winter, Might the quarter be forgiven her? And he sat down heavily in his own study chair as though he had been struck behind the knees. She had been mending his house. Not the valances only. The whole of it, the frightened maids, the soured cook. The tenants he had governed justly and never once seen. She had gone through his cold and orderly kingdom setting small right things to rights, asking nothing, signing nothing, and he had watched her do it from behind his glass and called it a temporary arrangement, and wagered on how soon she would flee. He rang for Aldous. When the old man came, Ledwin found he did not know what he had meant to ask, and so he asked the true thing, which was not his custom. Aldous, when she came to us, that first morning in the rain, I said she would not last the week. You did, your grace. Aldous stood very straight, as he had stood at that window a fortnight since, taking the wager with a bowed head. You did not think so. No, your grace. A pause, and then the old man gave him, at last, the thing his silence had been holding all these days, and gave it gently, which was the worse for being gentle. I thought she would last a very long while. I feared, if I may say it, that it was the rest of the house that would not last her, that we should grow so used to being the better for her that we should forget to be worth it. I find I was correct. Ledwin looked at the man who had served his father and watched his father sink, and understood that Aldous had been afraid for him, afraid of precisely this, of a Denstone who could stand at a warm window and let the one warm thing walk out into the rain because to keep it would have cost him the safety of feeling nothing. He had spent his whole life not being his father. He saw now, with a clarity that turned him cold, that he had contrived to sink in a manner his father had never managed, to drown on dry land, upright, behind the pane, without ever once letting the water touch him, and to call the drowning dignity. Thank you, Aldous, he said. That will be all. And when the door had closed, he put his face in his hands in the empty study, in the famous cold house, and sat so for a long time while the fire burned down and no one came to build it up. Because the only person in England who would have thought to was 3 days gone to Bath to earn her bread with the two things God had given her the wit for, and to owe it to no one, least of all to him. He went down to the kitchens the next morning, which no Duke of Denstone had done within living memory, because he could not bear the great rooms any longer, and because some instinct newly woken in him wanted to be near the last quarter of the house where she had been kind. Mrs. Penhallow rose from her table in a fluster at the sight of him, wiping floured hands, but he saw her eyes were red-rimmed still days on, and he found he did not know how to be there, having never in his life come to a servant as a man rather than a master. He asked her, awkwardly, whether the household did well. She said it did, your grace, well enough. And then, because grief makes even careful women brave, she added, it is only that the maids have gone back to jumping when I speak, your grace, and I had got out of the way of shouting this fortnight past, on account of Miss Underhill showing them a body could be minded without being frighted. I find I miss the quiet of it. We all of us do. She looked stricken to have said so much, and dropped a curtsy and turned to her dowry. But she had told him without meaning to. The same thing Aldous had told him, the ledgers had told him, and the straight-hung valance had told him. That the woman he had wagered against had left every corner of his kingdom warmer than she found it, and that he alone, of all the house, had been too proud to be warmed. Lady Audley's Holloway came again on the Thursday, to settle at last the matter of the date. She came in grey silk with her mother the Marchioness beside her, and they took their chocolate in the small drawing-room, and spoke of the church, and the breakfast, and which of the county must be asked, and Ledwin sat among the cups and heard himself answer, and watched the two of them the way a man newly given his sight watches faces he has known blind for years. He saw how Lady Audley's glance went round his rooms pricing them. He saw how the Marchioness's mouth made, without her leave, the shape of the word she had used a fortnight past, stray, whenever the talk brushed near the empty place at the foot of the table, and how her daughter did not once ask after the girl who had lately gone, not from unkindness, but from a completer thing, a simple inability to see that a schoolmistress had ever occupied a corner of the world worth the crossing of. They were not cruel, these two. He could not even give himself the cheap relief of a villain to be angry at. They were only cold, correct, and curious, everything he had prized in the arrangement, everything that had recommended it. A woman who did not want his heart, in a house built to give none. He had chosen her, he saw, precisely because she would never require him to feel the thing he was feeling now. He had chosen the harbour because it had no sea in it. "You are very silent, Denstone," said the Marchioness. "One hopes you are attending. We had thought the 2nd week of June." "Ma'am," he said, and set down his cup, and found that the marble he had worn all his life would not, this once, arrange itself over his face. "Ma'am, I must beg your pardon, and yours, Lady Ollie's, a graver pardon than I have any right to ask. I cannot fix the 2nd week of June. I cannot fix any week. I have wronged you both, and I wrong you further now, and I can only do it plainly and take the whole cost of it upon myself, where it belongs." The Marchioness set down her chocolate with a click. Lady Odalys did not change colour. She looked at him with a still attention that was, he understood, the nearest thing to feeling the arrangement had ever asked of her, and it was mostly curiosity. "You are breaking your engagement," she said. "Not a cry, an accounting. I am. And I will say to your face what a coward would put in a letter, that the fault is none of yours. You have been all that was promised. It is I who was missold. I told a man once that a certain person would not last a week beneath my roof, and I was a fool, for she has undone in me in a fortnight what 15 years were built to keep out, and I find I would rather be undone and honest than whole and lying at your side for 40 years. You deserve a man who is not, every hour of your marriage, elsewhere in his heart. I should have been that man. I never can be now. The blame is mine entire, and the settlement, the acres, whatever the solicitors reckon owed for the insult, you shall have to the last foot of the boundary. But I will not marry you. I am ashamed to have come so near to it for no better reason than that it asked nothing of me." There was a silence in which the fire's small collapse sounded very loud. The Marchioness rose in a great rustle of outrage and began upon the word scandal, upon what would be said, upon the ruin of 2 names, and Ledwin bore it standing and did not flinch, because he found that a man who has at last told the truth cannot be much frightened by the noise it makes. But it was Lady Odalys who ended it. She rose and drew on her gloves with unhurried care, and looked at him with something that was almost a kind of respect. "Mamma," she said, "we will go. His Grace has been more honest with us in 5 minutes than in 8 months, and it does not become us to punish the only honest thing he has done." At the door she paused. "I hope she is worth what you have just spent, Denstone, for your sake. A man does not often get the chance to throw away his whole life and be right to do it." And she went out, and the great door closed behind the grey silk and the lilies and the boundary of 3,000 acres. And the Duke of Denstone stood alone in the wreck of the safest bargain of his life. God help him, as though a window had been thrown open in a house that had been shut up for years. He did not sleep that night either, but it was a different waking. He rose before it was light and rang for Aldous and told him to have the travelling carriage put to, and the fastest pair for the western road. The old man's face did not move, but something behind it did, something that had waited a great while. "To Bath, your Grace, to Bath." To a Mrs. Trevanion, who keeps a school for girls, and to a schoolmistress there in a room with a window that faces the road. He was pulling on his gloves, and his hands were not quite steady, and he did not care that Aldous saw it. "I have a thing to say to her that I should have said across a desk, and did not, because I was a coward. I do not know that she will hear it. I do not deserve that she should. But I have let one road empty itself while I stood behind the glass, and I will not do it twice." "No, your Grace," said Aldous, and there was in the 2 dry words a warmth Ledwin had never once been given in all his careful reign, the warmth of a servant who has watched a master come, very late and at great cost, into the possession of his own soul. The road west took him 2 days, and he begrudged every hour of it. He who had prized his own composure above every other virtue now sat forward against the sway of the carriage, as though he might hurry it by wanting, and turned over and over the shape of what he had to say, and found that all his life's fluency had deserted him, that the man who could freeze a drawing-room with a sentence could not, for the length of 2 counties, assemble the plain words a frightened girl in a parish had deserved, and a schoolmistress in Bath must now be humbly asked to hear. He passed through the toll gates and the wet green country and the grey stone town at last as the light was failing on the 2nd day, and found the street, and the tall quiet house with the brass plate, and stood on the pavement in the dusk in his travelling dirt with his hat in his 2 hands like the footman who had once stood bareheaded in the cold to watch her go. A neat maid took his card and looked at the coronet on it, and then at the mud on his boots, as though the two could not be made to agree, and left him in a cold, clean parlour that smelt of chalk and beeswax, a schoolroom sort of room, poor and scrubbed and honest, everything his own house was not. He heard, somewhere above, the sound of young voices at their letters, and a step upon the stair he would have known among 1,000, that light particular step, and his heart, the organ he had spent 15 years persuading himself he had done without, set up such a labour in him that he had to put a hand to the back of a chair. She came in a plain dark gown with a bit of chalk dust on one cuff, and stopped upon the threshold and did not, for a moment, say anything at all. She was not broken. He had somehow feared he would find her diminished. And instead she stood in her poor, scrubbed parlour looking more wholly herself than she had ever managed to under the weight of his great cold roof, steady, clear-eyed, risen, a woman who had made her own way to her own window that faced the road and owed it to no one. It was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing he had ever seen, because it told him past all argument that she did not need him, that whatever he had come to say, he came as a supplicant and not a rescuer, empty-handed, with nothing to offer but the truth he had been too much a coward to speak. "Your Grace," she said at last, very quietly, her hands folding themselves in that way she had, "you are a long way from Denstone." "I am a long way from a great many things," he said, "that I was too proud and too frightened to leave until you had gone, and taken the whole warmth of my house out through the door in your 2 hands, and shown me the mausoleum I had been calling a life." He set down his hat. He did not sit. A man does not sit to say such things. "I have broken my engagement, Roswin. Not for you. I will not lay that at your door, nor make you answerable for my choosing. I broke it because I could not stand another hour of being the correct cold man who wanted nothing, when the plain truth is that I want, and have wanted since a wet morning at a window, when I wagered against the bravest person ever to cross my threshold, one single thing in all the world, and let her walk away into the rain, because to keep her would have cost me the safety I have wrapped round my heart since I was a boy who watched his father drown." His voice was not steady now, and he let it not be. 15 years of the marble fell off him there in the chalk-smelling parlour, all at once, and he stood before her stripped to the frightened, hoping man beneath, and found it was not death to be seen so, as he had always believed, but something much nearer to the first clean breath after a long time under water. "I have no house to offer you that you have any reason to trust," he said, "and no rank you ever once asked for, and no rescue, for you have plainly rescued yourself and done it better than I could have. I can offer you only a man who has been a fool, and knows the whole extent of it, and has come 2 days over bad roads to stand in your parlour and say it to your face, that I was wrong, that I am sorry, more sorry than I have words fit to carry, and that you have undone in me every cold thing I was so proud of, and I would not have one stitch of it mended. I do not ask you to answer me tonight. I ask only that you let me have said it at last out loud, where you can hear it, the thing I swallowed across the desk. I love you. I have loved you since you spoke to me of endurance as though it were a thing you had made an art of. And I have come to lay it before you with nothing in my hands, and beg you only to believe that it is true." He had rehearsed none of it, which was itself the measure of the change in him, for the Duke of Denstone had gone 15 years without saying a single sentence he had not first weighed and cooled and stripped of anything that might betray him. He stood now in the small bright parlour of Mrs. Trevanian's establishment in the circus at Bath with his hat in his own 2 hands, his own hands, ungloved, that had trembled on the reins somewhere past Chippenham and had not wholly steadied since, and he said the words as they came, unweighed, unarmoured, because he had learned at last that the weighing had been the whole of his cowardice. "I have not come to provide for you," he said. "I want that understood before anything else, because it is the thing I did wrong and I will not do it again. I have not come to place you, nor to settle a sum, nor to tidy an old debt of conscience. You told me once that you would rather owe me nothing, not even kindness, and you were right to say it, and I have thought of nothing else for 6 weeks. I have not come to give you anything, Roswin. I have come to ask." She had risen when he was shown in. She stood by the window with a slate still in her hand and a smudge of chalk along one knuckle, in a plain dark gown that was newer than the grey one and better made, bought, he understood, with money she had earned. And she did not sit, and she did not offer him the chair, and she did not soften. She only looked at him with the same steady quiet with which she had looked down the length of his table on the night he had broken them both, and waited, and made him do the whole of it himself. He was glad of it. He had come a great distance to be made to do the whole of it himself. "I broke my engagement to Lady Audley's," he said. "A fortnight passed. Not quietly. I did not slip out of it through the solicitors as it was made. I went to her mother's house and I said, before the Marchioness and before 3 of her relations who had come expressly to fix the wedding, that I could not marry her daughter, because I did not love her and never should, and because I had let a woman of 10 times her worth walk out of my house, rather than admit before witnesses that she mattered to me. The Marchioness told me I had run mad. Perhaps I have. It is the sanest I have felt in 20 years. Something moved in Roswin's face at that, not triumph, she had no triumph in her, but a kind of grave attention, as though he had at last begun to speak a language she recognized. He pressed on before his courage could cool, because he knew now how quickly it cooled, and how dear the cost of letting it. "You should know why I was as I was," he said. "I have never told it to a living soul, and I find I cannot ask you anything until I have told it to you. My mother loved my father past all sense or safety, and when he was taken from her, a fever, a fortnight, nothing anyone could fight. She did not outlast him by a year. She simply put herself down like a lamp. I was 9. I stood behind the banister on the great stair at Dentstone and watched them carry her after him, and I made myself a promise, the way a frightened child makes promises, in the dark, in earnest. I promised that I would never let the world see a thing I could not bear to lose. Because if the world cannot see what you love, I reasoned, the world cannot take it, and cannot break you by the taking. I built my whole life upon that one cold sentence. I built the marble you have seen. I built the silence, and the distance at supper, and the precise degree of a bow, and the wager, God forgive me, the wager I laid against you the first day, that you would flee my house within the week, because a woman who fled would prove I had been right all along to let no one stay. I know of the wager," she said. Her voice was even. "I have known since the first week. The scullery hears everything. Then you know I lost it," he said. "You know that better than any man alive. You did not flee. You stayed a fortnight, and you outlasted the 7 days. And then you outlasted the engagement I told myself I prized. You outlasted every safe, cold thing I had built, Roswin, without lifting a hand against one of them, only by standing in my house and being wholly yourself while I disgraced myself trying not to want you. And when you left, you did not flee then either. You walked out into the daylight with your head up and your trunk in your own 2 hands, and your whole life earned and waiting, and you left me the master of a house that felt, the moment your trap turned at the lodge, exactly like the room my mother died in. I have lived in that room for 6 weeks. I have eaten my suppers in it and ridden out in it and lain awake in it, and I have understood, slowly, the way a man understands a wound that will not close, that the thing I built my life to prevent had happened to me anyway. I had let the one creature I loved be lost. I had only managed to be the one who threw her away, instead of the one who was left. That is all my caution ever bought me, the privilege of doing the ruin myself." He set the hat down at last on the little table, because his hands had need of doing something, and there was nothing left to do with them but this. He crossed the small bright room until he was near enough to see the chalk on her knuckle, and he did not reach for her, because he had not earned the right and knew it. "I am not a safe man to love," he said. "I have proved that past all argument, but I have done with being a careful one. I stood in the Marchioness's drawing-room and named you before witnesses as the woman I had wronged, and I will stand in the pump-room here, or in the middle of the Abbey yard, or at my own board before every title in the county, and name you as the woman I love and point to you. And let the whole watching world see exactly where my heart is kept, which is the one thing the boy behind the banister swore he would never do, and the one thing I now cannot stop myself from doing, because you have unmade the whole of him, and I find I do not want him back. That is what you have undone in me. You should be told the size of it. You walked into my house a dependent, with an unpicked ribbon at your throat, and you dismantled, without trying, the entire architecture of my fear. For a long moment she did not speak. Somewhere below in the house a bell rang, and a murmur of girls' voices rose and receded down a passage, and the winter light off the bath stone lay pale and clean across the floor between them. And Roswin Underhill looked at him with the slate forgotten in her hand and her eyes very bright and very steady. "You must hear me carefully now," she said at last, "because I will say this once, and I will mean every word of it, and I will not have it mistaken." She set the slate down beside his hat, deliberately, the two things side by side on the small table, and she folded her hands. "I have a place here. It is a good place, and an honest one, and it is mine. I have a room with a window that faces the road, and a salary I earn, and 30 girls who are the better for my keeping of them, and a mistress who values me, and my bread is my own and owed to no one. I tell you this so that you understand what I am refusing. If I refuse, I do not need to be rescued, Ledwin. I was not drowning. I was standing at last, on my own 2 feet, exactly as I told you I had wanted since the day I came, and I would go on standing, contented and useful and free, to the end of my life, and count it no small thing. If you have come to lift me up out of some meanness of circumstance, I will thank you and send you home, because I've lifted myself, and I want no rescuing hand, and least of all a ducal one. I know it," he said very low. "I have never in my life met anyone who needed rescuing less. That is not why I came. If it were, you would have every right to send me down these stairs and think me a fool for climbing them. A man does not ride through a January night to save a woman who has already saved herself. He rides to beg a share in the life she has made, and to be told, honestly, whether there is room in it for him, knowing there may not be, and knowing he has earned the door if there is not. There was very nearly not," she said quietly. "You should know that too. For a fortnight after I came here I taught my letters and my figures, and I told myself I had done exactly right, and I had, and I was glad of it, and I did not want you. And then a morning would come when the road outside my window was empty and grey, and I would find I was watching it, though I had nothing to watch it for. I told myself it was habit. I told myself, as you told yourself of the ripples, that it would smooth. It did not smooth." She looked at him steadily. "So do not suppose you have caught me in some pretty helplessness, and come in time to be my fortune. You have come in time to be my ruin, if you are careless of me again, for I have let you back into a heart I had closed against you with a good deal of effort. Be certain, before you ask, that you know the weight of the thing you are asking for." "No," she agreed, and now, at last, something in her voice gentled, and it went through him like the first warmth of a fire into cold hands. "I do not think it is, so I will tell you the rest of it, since we are being brave this morning." She drew a breath. "I did not stop hoping for you at that supper, because I stopped caring for you. I stopped because I could not bear to go on caring for a man who would not own that I existed. You wounded me very much, and you must know that too, and not be spared it. But I did not leave your house because I had ceased to love you, Ledwin. I left because I loved you and would not be a temporary arrangement to any man, not even to the one I loved, because a woman who will not stand for herself has nothing worth giving. So you see we are neither of us so different as your table would have had it. I too would rather lose a thing than hold it in a lie." "Then hold it in the truth," he said. "That is the whole of what I am asking. Not the ledger, not the roof, not the rescue. Only, be my wife, Roswin, and let me spend the rest of a life I very nearly wasted learning to deserve the thing you would be giving me. Keep your window that faces the road, if you will, and your slate, and every stubborn ounce of the independence that shames my whole cowardly history. I would not take a grain of it from you. I do not want a dependent. I never did, God help me, though I called you one to my everlasting disgrace. I want the woman who passed the sort at the foot of my table with more dignity than the head of it possessed. I want the north back in my compass. I want to be seen the way you saw me in the storm light, once, before I taught myself to be afraid of it. Marry me, not for the rank. I know you do not want the rank. Marry the man who is not much, and is yours entirely, and has come to Bath in the cold to tell you so with his hat in his hands like any other frightened fellow who has finally understood what he loves." She looked at him a moment longer, and then Roswin Underhill, who had never once in his house given him a fraction more than courtesy required, closed the last of the small bright distance between them herself, and laid her chalk-smudged hand against the side of his face, the first time she had ever touched him of her own accord. And it undid him more completely than any word, and said softly, "Yes, Ledwin, the man, only ever the man." And the Duke of Denstone, who had not wept since he was 9 years old behind a banister, bowed his head into her hand and was, for a moment, not able to speak at all. They were married in the spring at Denstone, and he kept every promise he had made in the little parlour, and one he had not spoken aloud, for he would not have it done quietly. A prouder or a smaller man might have wed a schoolmistress in a side chapel with 2 witnesses and a hush, and let the county keep its whispers. But Ledwin had done with hush. He opened the great house to its fullest, threw the long table to its every leaf, and summoned to the wedding every title that had studied its plate the night the Marchioness called Rosewin astray, and he seated the new Duchess of Denstone at the head of his board in her own right, and he stood before all of them and named her plainly, warmly, at length. The gentlewoman of more true quality than any coronet in the room, the woman who had outlasted his coldness and his wager and his folly, and had married him at last for nothing in the wide world but himself. He watched the Marchioness's face go stiff and small over it, and Lady Odalys incline her sleek head with a smile that had gone thin at the edges, and he did not care one particle, and found the not caring the sweetest freedom he had ever known. Let the whole watching world see exactly where his heart was kept. He pointed to it before witnesses with a steady hand. The household that had wept to see her go turned out to see her come home mistress of it. Mrs. Penhallow, who had pressed bread and cold fowl into her hands at the last, wept again, and pretended stoutly it was the draught. Aldous Grave and Grey, who had once wagered against her at a window, and carried her single trunk down with his own hands, stood at the door of the great hall and bowed to her as low as he had ever bowed to anyone in 40 years of service, and murmured as she passed, that the house had been very cold in her absence, your grace, and was glad of the thaw. And Ledwin, overhearing, thought it the truest sentence any servant had ever spoken in that hall, and in the years that followed, for there were many, and they were good, the county learned to speak the Duchess of Denstone's name with a respect that had nothing in it of her rank and everything of herself. For she kept a school in the village at her own charge, and a steady hand over more than pupils, and never once forgot what it was to pass the salt at the foot of a table and be overlooked. The great cold house was cold no longer. It filled, in time, with warmth and with children and with the particular unhurried grace of a woman entirely at peace, and the man who had built his whole life to keep the world from seeing what he loved could most often be found, of a winter evening, doing the very opposite. Seated near the fire with his wife's hand in his, and no marble anywhere about him, watching her over the top of some book he had long since stopped reading, plainly helplessly for anyone at all to see. She caught him at it once, the children long abed, the fire fallen to embers. "You are staring, Ledwin," she said, without looking up from her mending, in the old droll, dry, gentle way that had undone him from the first. "I am," he said. "I mean to go on doing it, madam, for the remainder of my natural life. I lost 7 days to a foolish wager once, betting a woman would run from this house within the week." He lifted her hand and turned it in his own, the hand that had chalk on it still some evenings from the schoolroom, and he pressed his lips to the knuckle where the chalk used to be. "I have been trying to win her back to it every day since, on far better terms. I find I do not intend ever to stop." Roswin set down her mending then, and looked at him and smiled the slow, unhurried, wholly given smile he had crossed half of England in the cold to earn, and the north held steady in his compass, and the old fear did not so much as stir, and the Duke of Denstone, who had once told his butler she would not last a week, sat cherishing to the end of his days the one soul the whole world had overlooked, and knew himself, at last and past all wagering, a fortunate man.